Muy buenas tardes a todos ustedes. Bien, tengo el honor de presentar al doctor Matthew Bell. Él obtuvo su título en Psicología de la Universidad de Nuevo México y su maestría y doctorado en Psicología Experimental en la Universidad de California en San Diego. Después estuvo por 3 años como científico postdoctorante en el Centro de Teratología Conductual en la Universidad Estatal de San Diego, California. Se unió al Departamento de Psicología de la Universidad de Santa Clara en 2001, donde es actualmente profesor y jefe de departamento. Actualmente es editor asociado del Journal of the Experimental Analysis of Behavior. Como analista de la conducta, su investigación se centra en los principios fundamentales del aprendizaje, como el reforzamiento condicionado, la conducta de elección y la persistencia. Recientemente ha estudiado el proceso de recuerdo en adultos de edad avanzada y estudiantes universitarios, incluyendo investigación centrada en herramientas de aprendizaje y técnicas benéficas para el aprendizaje del estudiante universitario. Démosle la bienvenida al doctor Matthew Bell.
Hola, ¿cómo estás? Gracias por la oportunidad de hablar hoy sobre mi investigación, pero necesito hablar en inglés solamente. So I'm going to talk mostly in English because it would be bad if I did this in Spanish. My Spanish is not as good as I would like it to be. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today. And what I'd like to do is to really give you a retrospective of the research that I've done with my colleagues at Santa Clara University around the spacing benefit. That's my objective today. So here's the plan. Gracias. Here's the plan. I'll tell you a little bit about me and my background, which you just heard a little bit of, so I'll go through it quickly. Then I want to talk about my perspective as I talk about memory as it relates to the spacing benefit. And I'll talk about experiments that I've done with spacing and aging, both with older adults, older pigeons, and looking at context effects with older adults. Then I'll talk about the sleep studies that we did, college student learning, and then where I'm headed. And one of the things to notice here is that the kind of research that I've been involved in around spacing has really been pretty broad. And I'll talk a bit about why that is. It's partly driven by where I work. I work at Santa Clara University in California, and the population that I work with are undergraduates. We don't have a PhD program. We don't have a master's program. And so much of the research is driven by the interest of the students as it fits with us. So our research program has been a little varied in terms of the projects we've taken on. So as they mentioned, I went to the University of New Mexico, and then I went to UCSD, I'm used to being able to control myself. I went to UCSD and actually went through graduation because the person who was the commencement speaker was at the time the president of the US. I thought that was a good chance to see the president up close, so I chose to go through the program. It was interesting. My interest in research really is around the experimental analysis of behavior. Really, that is my primary research focus. And I've done studies on behavioral momentum, which is about persistence of responding. I've done studies on choice behavior, condition reinforcement, and if people do behavior analysis will know what that means. I've also done a number of studies on trying to improve student learning, research on teaching, and I'll tell you a little bit about that later. And I've been doing a lot of collaborative work looking at the spacing benefit. Oops. That was a picture taken by my students secretly of me. That's me teaching. So I've taught a lot of different places, but most of what I teach are classes in the science of psychology and behavior analysis, which is the approach within psychology often. The place I want to start is really to think about me as a behavior analyst. The tendency of behavior analysts or behaviorists is to think about cognitive processes as, traditionally to think of them as unimportant. We ignore them. That differs from what cognitive psychologists do. Cognitive psychologists worry about what's happening inside, right? They propose this, that the mechanisms causing behavior are internal. So to me, I think about this discord, and I really want to bridge the gap. I want to have people talk to each other across the different disciplines because I think it's an opportunity for us to do better research. Really, that's my goal, is to be doing better research. And so to give you a sense of how these things differ, I've chosen a few terms that I think sort of get at that idea. So if you think of the study of memory, what that means to most people is you're studying something that's going on inside the head. You're studying some process, or you're studying something inside the brain. A behavior analyst, on the other hand, is going to think about remembering, is going to think about the activity, the behavior that's happening, and isn't going to worry so much about what's going on in the head. Because ultimately, that's what I care about. If my students are taking a test, I don't really need to know if they have a memory of it. I need to know that they're able to remember it for the exam. Similarly, the idea of attention, right? The idea of attention is something going on inside your head that allows you to focus on what's going on. So I can focus my attention on individuals in the audience. The problem is I can't see attention either. So as a behavior analyst, I find that challenging. The way in which I think about attention is stimulus control, that there are things in the environment that affect the ability of me to perform in a certain way. So for example, at the moment, my behavior is under the stimulus control of my PowerPoint slide over here, right? Things I'm choosing to say are based on what I'm seeing here. And so it gets at this fundamental difference in terms of what you're asking to explain your phenomena. For cognitive psychologists, I think they're often trying to look inside, and behaviorists are going to look outside. They're going to look at environmental variables that affect performance. I like this quote by Aubrey Daniels because I think that he's an organizational psychologist, and I think that this captures my perspective on this. He says, psychologists study the mind, behavior analysts study behavior and how to optimize desirable behavior. Although behavior is the window to the mind, I prefer to leave people's minds alone. What goes on in other people's minds is, frankly, none of my business. The point here is, I don't know that I gain much explanatory power by referencing the mental state often. So as a behavior analyst, one of the things that I worry about is what's controlling behavior. And I worry about the internal mechanisms that cognitive people try to talk about. And one of the things that they'll do in spacing theories is they'll talk about things that are happening inside, right? So study phase retrieval says that what you're doing at the time that you're studying or trying to remember what you need to remember later is what's really the most important thing in terms of a spacing benefit happening. So you study something at one time and you remember it at another time and then you're tested later. And I'll show you the procedure in just a minute. There's this other theory called desired difficulties. Desired difficulties says it has to be hard enough for you to remember for you to be able to remember it. So it has to be at the right level of difficulty. If it's too easy, you won't remember it later on. If it's too hard, you won't remember it later on. The problem with this theory in particular is that you can never disprove the theory. So if you remember it later on, then it's because it was at the right level of difficulty. If you don't remember it later on, it's because it was at the wrong level of difficulty. But there's no way to be a good scientist and disprove the theory. Retrieval effort hypothesis is a similar kind of theory. There are a number of theories about the environmental effects in the cognitive realm. This is a place that's closer to my heart. This is more behavioral. For example, the contextual variability stimulus sampling theory, stimulus fluctuation model really all circulate around the idea that you're not just learning the thing you're trying to learn, but you're learning the events in the environment that connect to that, or the stimuli in the environment that connect to that. So I might not remember, be able to remember it unless I'm in that classroom, right? You've probably heard that advice. If you want to remember something, one way to remember it well is to study in the environment where you'll be tested. The idea here is really the cues in the environment allow you to remember. The problem that I run into is that I think there are just way too many theories that nitpick over details. And from my perspective, as a behavior analyst, people are worrying about all of these internal mechanisms. One more. And I don't know that it helps us move forward. Like if my goal, which one of my goals is to be useful in understanding how spacing benefit works, and I don't know that all of this model testing serves that purpose for me. Let me give you an example of a simple example of why I take issue. So I think this is a claim about behavior, right? A rat drinks water because it's thirsty. That's a theory. The rat is drinking water because it is thirsty. Well, let's think about that. We know it drinks water. Why does it drink water? It's thirsty. Okay. How do I know? It's drinking water. Now, what have I explained with that? All I've done is label the behavior. So I see this as a real challenge for me as a behavior analyst for cognitive theories, is that I end up in these, what to me seems circular explanatory loops. So before I start talking about actually spacing benefit, I hope what I've done is give you a sense that I'm approaching the study of spacing from a particular direction. And I want to give you a real visceral experience of the spacing benefit and see if I can get it to work with you. So I hope you'll indulge me. So if you have a piece of paper, you'll be able to write down your answers. So if you want to get out a piece of paper, please do so. Otherwise, it will be much harder for you. So as a good behavior analyst, one of my jobs is to engage your behavior a little bit. This is me doing exactly that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read you this list of words, 36 words. Some of them, of course, as I say here, will be masked, some will be spaced. While I'm reading them, if you'd please just listen. And then once I finish, I'll pause a moment, and then I'll ask you to write down as many as you can recall. Okay? Here we go. Are we ready? See? So first, just listen. Here's the list. And I did it in Spanish, so we'll see how my pronunciation goes here. Vaso. Hogar. Hogar. Torre. Clave. Bolsa. Bolsa. Moda. Juicio. juicio, actor, cena, muda, pase, pase, dicho, primo, clave, cuero, cuero, actor, llave, llave, forma, bote, reino, reino, forma, primo, grande, grande, cena, dicho, hábito, hábito y bote. Okay, please write down as many as you can remember and then set that aside. So I'll give you 30 seconds to write stuff down. Okay, so hold on to that. I'll give you the list again later. Keep that hidden away somewhere for a few minutes. The place that we got started in doing spacing research, the procedure came from this study by Cepeda and colleagues published 10 years ago now. And I'm going to walk you through the procedure in some detail because we took advantage of this procedure because they lent us the computer program, which made our job pretty easy. And so we stuck with it for a number of studies because we were able to quickly engage our undergraduates in doing this research. And here's the procedure. The green is a little hard to read, so I'll walk you through it. The way the cognitive people will talk about it is you have this first phase, the encoding phase, where what people would do who participate in this experiment would do is they would read a list of word pairs. And they'd have to get the word pair correct in this particular procedure twice in a row before they were considered to have learned it. And then you'd have a spacing period in their study of somewhere between 0 and 14 days across conditions. And then from there, they had a final test 10 days out. So there's a learning session, there's a remembering session, and then there's a final test. And what they were interested in, of course, is what's the effect of this spacing gap on recall 10 days later. So here's the procedure in a little more detail. There's the first session, the encoding session, and what they were doing is showing Swahili English word pairs. And so in showing Swahili English word pairs, the assumption was that the participants had no idea, had no knowledge of the Swahili words, right? They didn't know Swahili. They knew English, but they didn't know Swahili. So they'd be presented with something like Johnny, and then shown the word grass, and then they would be tested, Johnny, and they would have to type in grass. And if they typed in grass, then that was correct, and if they got it wrong, it would go back in and they'd have to be presented it again until they finally got it right, and they'd be given feedback at that stage. Then they'd come back anywhere between 0 and 14 days, and they'd be presented with a test, and this test had no feedback. So they'd be given the word Johnny, and they'd have to write down grass if they could remember it, and then 10 days later, they'd have that final test. Hope that's clear. Here's what they found. So the things to pay attention to here is the open circles for experiment 1 is the test at that second point. So after they've learned it the first time, they come back for that test 0 to 14 days later, and you see a forgetting curve. That's your typical memory forgetting curve, right? They do really well if you test them immediately after. That second training session is immediately after. They do really well. They're up at 90-something% of the words. You test them 14 days out, they're down around 25% of the words. Okay. Now look at what happens 10 days out. Those are the filled circles, the dark circles. There's a drop in performance when the gap is 0 days between the first and the second session. So when they do it immediately and then are tested 10 days out, they're performing a little above 50%. And then as you have any kind of gap embedded in there, 1 day up to 14 days, performance remains pretty stable and is higher than massing, right? So in this particular study, what they showed is that the gap between 1 day and 14 days had an equal effect on performance, more or less, 10 days out. They also looked at data in terms of a set of meta-analysis that they had done earlier. And what this shows is their attempt to look at gaps versus how long out you test. So the gap is between the first and the second session, and the test is between the second and the third session. And what they're claiming here, and I think they have some evidence, is that there's a relationship between the two. So the longer the gap between the first and the second session, the farther out you can test and have higher performance, right? There's a benefit long-term relative to longer gaps. Although the data are a little bit noisy, I hope you'd agree. And one of the things that's challenging about that is most of the studies that are done with small gaps, right? There's a very few amount of studies that are done with long delays on the order of days or weeks. And I think the answer, the question is, why is that? I think the answer is simple. Those are hard to do. They're very hard to do. Oops, go back one more. Perfect. So spacing and aging. The reason we decided to study spacing and aging is twofold. I started this collaboration with Patty Simone in my department, and the reason we decided to collaborate is we wanted to do something different that brought together my perspective in behavior analysis and her perspective as somebody who's interested in gerontology. We also wanted to study the benefit of spacing on older adults because, frankly, we're getting older and we want to know what can we do to help ourselves remember, because it's happening. So one of the places we started is this study by Bellotta and colleagues. And the details here aren't really important. I'm just sharing them in case they're of interest to you. The idea here is they're looking at older and younger adults. And they're going to have lags within the sessions. So that's like between the first and the second. And then there's going to be a retention interval where they're going to test performance. So this is doing the procedure within a session rather than doing it over multiple days. So, for example, if you had a lag 0, retention interval 2, you would show word pairs back to back. That's the lag of 0. And then 2 items after that would follow the prompt for the test. Then if you look at lag 4, retention interval 2, you see that there are 4 items between the 2 training prompts, and that final test has 2 items. Hopefully that makes that procedure kind of clear. And here's what they found. They found that there's a difference in terms of the retention interval within this procedure, so that the longer retention interval consistently led to poorer performance, so the dashed lines are below the straight lines. And interestingly, what's interesting to me is the age difference, right? So the functions for younger and older adults look pretty similar, except the older adult performance is below the younger adults. So we started to ask the question, well, what does this look like? Like, how can we leverage this? How can we understand this? And what can we start to do to try and find ways to improve older adults' performance? So our first attempt to do this was in collaboration with Cepeda, who lent us the program. And we took younger adults, older adults, and did the same task that they did in that study I just showed you, right? So we do the encoding phase, the retrieval phase, and the test phase. But for the spacing, we used either immediate or 1 day. And so we randomized people to be either in the masked group, so zero delay, or space, they'd come back one day later. And from a practical perspective, this is a hard study to accomplish. Like when we were designing it, it seemed so easy. Just have people do this thing, and then they'd come back and we'd have a bunch of data. But they come in for a session, half of them have to come back one day later, and then everybody has to come back 10 days after that. That's very hard to get people to engage in that process. Really challenging. I'll show you two pieces of data from this study. This is for the first one that shows that we get a spacing benefit for both younger and older adults, and that the effect is such that older adults get a spacing benefit, but the benefit looks to be smaller and overall performance is lower. So this replicates or is consistent with the results from the Belota study. And the thing that's really interesting to me is this other graph. And what we did is we took the data from that first learning session where they were learning how to do the task. And the way the task works in this particular program is once they get it right 2 times in a row, those words are considered to be learned. We could argue about whether or not that's true, but we considered them, for the purpose of this study, they were learned. So we would take them out, and then the set would grow smaller. So they would learn, out of 20 words, they'd learn the first 5 words, and that's the first quartile. Then the second 5 words is the second quartile, and so on. So the last quartile is them learning that last set of 5 words and getting them perfect. And what you notice with the younger adults is up through that last quartile, they do pretty well, regardless of whether they're in MAST or SPACE. MAST performs not as well at that distant 10-day test as SPACE does, but consistently across the first day, you can't predict how they'll do in the last day, except maybe for the MAST 4th quartile. For the older adults, though, there's a really nice pattern of data here, I think, in that we have a spacing benefit, but we also have this decline in performance as a function of when they are in the session. Right? So when they're first in the session and they're learning these words early, they're doing great. Then as they move along, performance drops. Right? And this is one of the findings that I think is particularly interesting that we haven't had an opportunity to follow up on. The other thing I do as a behavior analyst is I study pigeons. So we wanted to take an operant conditioning task where pigeons peck at lit keys and earn food for doing this. And we wanted to try and model what we were finding with older adults with my pigeons. So I have a group of pigeons that are probably about 18 years old, and a group of pigeons that at the time were very young, about a year old. And so what we would do is show them a sample stimulus, so they're working for food. And then we put in a delay of some value, and then we give them a choice. If they matched the sample, they'll get food. And if they don't, they won't get food. Right? So what we're doing is training them. When you see red as the sample, you have to remember red later on. And what I wanted to do was to do a reversal where they had to do a delayed non-matching to sample. So for one set of conditions, they'd learn red goes to red, and then we'd change the rules, and they'd have to learn red goes to green. These are the preliminary data. What you'll see here with the younger pigeons, across the x-axis is the delay. There's not much of a difference. There's a curve as a function of the delay, which is good. We predict that. But there's not much of a difference between the matching to sample and the non-matching to sample, which is kind of interesting. And with older birds, we have a big performance difference as a function of the birds that do the matching task and the non-matching task. Why is this happening? We don't know yet. I mean, this is one of the studies that we're following up on at the moment. But this is to give you a sense of the kind of different kinds of projects we're taking on to think how to think about spacing and how does that affect memory. Then once we did the studies with humans, right, we've taken this detour with pigeons, and I'm showing that mostly because pigeons are in my history, and I want to share that with you briefly. But we went back with the human work and we asked, well, how can we affect change in performance, right? How can we help older adults remember better? And we thought maybe context has something to do with it. And this is driven by some of the cognitive context theories, but also because as a behavior analyst, I know the role that context can play on behavior, on performance. So we did this study that uses the same task you've seen before, the English Swahili words, learn to perfection, test them 1 day later, test them 10 days after that. And the only thing that we manipulated among conditions was the context. So half of the subjects were in the same room for all 3 sessions or all 3 parts. The other half changed room in the middle. We controlled for the time, because it took time to get to the second room. But the only thing that really was different in terms of the protocol was where they were for that second session. So even if they were masked, they would get up from that space, walk down to the other room, and do their test. Here's what we found. So here on the left is the older adult data, which replicates what we did before. And then here is the same thing done with younger adults. What's interesting here is particularly is what happens with the older adults. What happens with the older adults is that simple context change. Look at the effect it had on spaced performance. It got rid of the spacing benefit. We also have a little bit of a question mark with what happened with the younger adults and their masked performance. Don't know why that happened. This is one of the things we want to follow up on. But for my purposes, what's really important here is by changing the context, we were able to eliminate the spacing benefit, which suggests that older adults at least are using contextual cues to help them remember. As we thought about context, we thought about the role of sleep in this too. I mean, sleep isn't quite a contextual change, but it came to us as this is kind of related. And maybe in describing the procedure, this will make sense. So this was only with undergraduates. We haven't done this with older adults yet because, as I say, this is time-consuming work to do. We took a number of undergraduates, did our same Swahili English training test, and did the same masked and spaced kind of thing. So that's 12 hours and 24 hours. The manipulation that's interesting is this 12-hour manipulation, right? So 12 hours either the same day, so they'd come in at 9 in the morning and they'd come back at 9 at night, or they'd come in at 9 at night and then come back at 9 in the morning. So in terms of context, there's this sleep period where not much is happening in terms of input, whereas during the day, there's a lot of input, right? So maybe it has something to do with context. And these are the results. And what's really, to me, particularly interesting is, statistically at least, this splits into the left 2 columns and the right 2 columns as being the same. So in other words, masked and 12-hour same day are statistically in this study equal, even though there's a small difference there, and maybe with more power, you would see an effect. And 12-hour and 24-hour are statistically the same. And what this tells me, what this suggests is that 12 hours isn't 12 hours, right? 12 hours overnight is better than 12 hours during the day. Now, why is that? I don't know. I mean, I can guess, I have guesses about that. But again, this is a place in which we could think about how could we take this and give older adults advice about how to improve their ability to remember things, right? A good night's sleep is important. We also were interested in the practical effects in terms of helping our students learn. And really I'm going to talk about these 2 studies as if they're one study because they're kind of the same thing. We were working with college students and we were looking at online course supplements for intro psychology. And the reason we were doing this is because when you teach introductory psychology, the textbooks, they'll have online things and they say, this is the best online thing you've ever seen. It will help your students learn, and you don't have to do anything. I didn't believe them. So we did this study where we took online packages provided by different textbook publishers, and we would have them do an online quiz and then an in-class quiz, or we'd have them do an in-class quiz and an online quiz, right? So if in the second case, there wouldn't be any short-term benefit of that. And what we were finding is no matter how many online quizzes they took, it didn't seem to affect performance. So the blue bars represent how many students took the online quizzes 0 times, 5 times, 7 times. Most students in this case were taking the quiz many times. And then the red line represents how well did they do as a function of that. It didn't seem to affect performance. We did a second experiment where we tried to do something that we thought would really push around performance so we'd see a difference. And we were doing online quizzes versus in-class quizzes, or they didn't have to do anything, and then they had to do the in-class quiz. They had the opportunity to do the online quizzes, but they didn't have to do it, and so we could track this, and you can imagine how many students actually chose to do the online quizzes when they didn't have to do it. None of them. Which makes sense. I'm not faulting them. Did it affect performance? No. And we tried some things where we look at doing it so that they had to do one thing first and another thing second, or so that they have to go and do no quizzing and then online quizzing, or do quizzing and then no quizzing. Didn't seem to matter. We didn't get an effect. Like, it didn't help them at all. The one thing we did find is this effect. So in one of our studies, this is a within subjects manipulation. People were either doing online quizzing or they were doing nothing. And we found a statistically significant effect. The p-value is 0.002. Yay? You look at the actual numbers. If you go to, oops, sorry, go back, sorry. Those are the actual number correct out of 10. 8.1 out of 10 versus 7.75 out of 10. That's a statistically significant difference. Is it a meaningful difference? Is it a reason to adopt online course stuff? I don't think so. I don't think so. This led us to do a study that, this is some pretty recent data for us, where we were asking the question more broadly. So rather than try and do it within one particular class, let's ask the question about how courses are sequenced. So we collaborated with a colleague in the chemistry department who teaches organic chemistry, and at our institution it's 3 classes. And it's either taught a sequence of 3 classes over the course of the year, or you could take it as a summer class. So in summer, they're doing very quick course sequencing. So really, we saw this as massed versus spaced. Here's what we found. They were taking a standardized chemistry test. So the American Chemical Society provides a standardized test for assessing students' knowledge as they come out of a chemistry exam. And this shows a distribution of scores as a percentage of students getting a particular score across this distribution of scores. This is at time 1, so this is immediately after completing the class. And what this suggests, I think, is that the summer students did a little bit better, right? That massing really helped students in this particular task a little bit, because the curve is a little bit to the right. Okay. We also tested them about a month after this. So we got a subset of the students to come back and take the same exact test over again. And this is how they did. Notice here, the summer students' performance is low compared to the full year students. Right? There's a huge drop-off in performance. So one practical thing is, if you're going to take a summer session class, know that you won't remember it as well as you would otherwise. So we've done a bunch of studies that have looked at spacing in a bunch of different ways, and frankly, we have a lot of room to follow up on these studies. As I mentioned before, our reason for doing a lot of this is driven by projects that our undergraduates were interested in, so we want to support their activity in this and also benefit our kind of theme of studying spacing. We're now in a position where we're going to start being a little more systematic, and one of the things that we want to do is to look at performance and eye tracking, and I'll show you where that comes from. Nate Cornell did this study with undergraduates, and they were doing an interesting thing, I think, because I think it has more external validity, looking at painting and artist names. So they'd be shown a series of paintings and be asked to remember artist names, and they were presented within a session as either masked, so they'd see the same painting multiple times and they'd have to give you the artist name, or they would do it in a spaced form. And so in this case, the very top graph or painting is the same as the very bottom painting. So they'd be shown a series of paintings, and the spaced painting would show up throughout the session. And here, the gist of what they found is that spacing does better than massing. I know that the results are a little more complicated than that, but the message here for me is spacing is, in this study, is benefiting performance. Well, what is it that they're doing in massing versus spacing in this kind of a task? And the way we wanted to ask this question, the way we're trying to start to ask this question, is to do some eye tracking. So these are some really preliminary data that we have from our eye tracking equipment. We're trying to look at what people look at. So as things get read, they're spending more time looking at those things on the piece of art. So we would put the piece of art followed by the artist's name below it, and we'd ask them to study those stimuli for a period of time, and then we would test them later. And we would present them either as masked or we would present them as spaced. And our prediction is that this gets to me to be more behavioral. We're trying to track what they're looking at, or if you like, what's capturing their attention. And what we find is we find a spacing effect, and we find an early-late effect that's different than what Cornell's data show, and we're not quite sure why that is, and so this is one of the studies that we're planning to follow up on, but I wanted to give you a sense of where we're headed. I'll show you one other thing that we're thinking about. This gets to the core of the behavior analyst in me, is we want to start looking at motivation or reinforcement, like what's the motivation of people to study or to learn these things. And it was brought to the forefront of what I want to attend to, in part because of this study by Vaughan and Cornell, the title of which is How to Activate Students' Natural Desire to Test Themselves. As a behavior analyst, I have no idea what natural desire is. And in fact, I don't know that I can tap into that in any systematic way. Here's how they went about doing it. They had undergraduates, they were shown word pairs, and they would either get a pure test where they were shown the prompt idea and they'd have to give the response of seeker, or they were given hints with varying amounts of difficulty, so easy on the right, harder on the left, or they'd just be given the answer. Here's the answer, learn this answer. And the two things that they looked at, this is across a couple of different studies, is what did they choose to do? So what are the students choosing to do? Are they choosing to do the zero-letter thing that's hard? Mostly not, right? Mostly they're choosing the assisted prompt. So if they're given a choice between 2 letters and 4 letters as a prompt, and the other 2 options, they're going to choose 4 letters. So it's a little bit hard, but not so easy, not super hard, not super easy. If they're given a choice between 0 and 6 letters, so between nothing and everything, they choose the easy thing. How does that affect their performance later on? The thing to attend to here is, in the initial phase, the very left graph shows 0 to 6 letters, how well they did when they were doing the initial test, and surprisingly, not surprisingly, when you give them the answer, they do really well. It's super easy. At the final test, though, for this phase here, notice that performance for the full 6 letters is lower than for all of the other prompts, all the other conditions. And that remains consistent regardless of whether you look at these two conditions, which are just two versions of the same experiment, or you look over here where in the first condition they thought it was too hard maybe for students because performance is very low. When they went and did it so that it was easier, you had the same kind of pattern of behavior. So Vaughan and Cornell want to argue that you can give students a slightly easier task and they're more likely to do it. That makes sense. But I don't want to rely on that as my mechanism for thinking about this. The way I think about it is that students have a choice of massing or spacing, and you probably have done this if you've taught classes or been students, you've heard, don't cram. True? Don't cram, don't mass your study. Do students follow that advice? No. Why is that? In the short term, massing works really well. So if you've got an exam tomorrow, you should cram if your goal is to do well on that exam. Because if you were just spacing out your learning at that next time point, you will probably not do as well. So there's a lot of reinforcement value for cramming, for massing. Right? There's a reason to be doing that task. And there's a disincentive to do the spacing because you don't perform as well. And that's probably discouraging. And I think that's what the Vaughan and Cornell study is trying to say is students, when they're struggling, they don't like it. Right? So I want to find a way to think through that problem where what we're doing is we're providing reinforcement, positive feedback for engaging in the task. And that could either be through helping them learn how to do that themselves. That's certainly one way to do it. The studies that I've seen on that don't do a particularly good job, or engineering the class to do that. So this is what I've tried to share with you, right? There are a number, there's an ocean of theories about why spacing works. A lot of the cognitive theories, in my opinion, are not particularly useful to me. And I think that they're nitpicky and they get away from what I'm interested in, which is how can I help people remember more later? And what I've done with my colleagues, Dr. Simoni and Dr. Whitfield, is to try and look at spacing across a number of different paradigms and a number of different procedures to try and get a sense of what are the things that are going to help improve the benefit of spacing in terms of learning. Is it has to do with context? What are the age-related effects? What are the spacing kinds of benefits that are optimal for somebody learning something? How does sleep work? How can we apply that to other kinds of populations like college students? We know that training spacing matters. We know that the age matters. We know that context matters. Sleep is good, although our research is only with undergraduates. There's a lesson in terms of spacing in that it may be ineffective. So the teaching studies we were doing was really trying to implement spacing for the students, and I kind of glossed over that, but we were really trying to get spacing to work for them, and we got nothing for doing that. And I think ultimately arranging the feedback they get, the reinforcement that they get is really what's going to matter. Now it's time for you to test. Write down as many of the words as you can remember. And don't cheat and look at your old list. So as you look at your list of words, if you would for me, do me the favor, count up how many you have correct out of these words that were on the list, and count up how many you got correct on this side, both at the first time I asked you to recall and this second time. So I've never done this demo before. I'm interested to see if it works. So if you would, simply take an accounting. Did you get more correct here or here? So if you would, if you would raise your hands. How many of you got more correct here? So look around. Okay. Here? Some of you, okay. This may disprove my hypothesis. That's okay. This is why I do science. That's why I do science. Right? The words here on the left were the spaced words. The words on the right were the massed words. Right? So this was my attempt to try and give you a visceral experience of the kind of spacing studies that we do, the kinds of things that you might be doing if you were a participant in our lab. Okay. So finally, thank you for spending an hour with me. I appreciate your attention, and I think after this, there'll be a brief pause, and then we'll have questions, I think. Thank you.
Vamos a dar...